Hello, I am Ryan O'Dowd, and this is the Black Hand Communique. Today's episode is going to be called Brick Breaker, the Collapse of the Petrodollar. And in this episode, I am going to try to sum up what I feel is a core component in most of the geopolitical struggles happening in the world right now. In particular, those between the competing economic blocks in the West in the form of NAFTA and the Euro working together, and in the East in the form of Russia, China, and soon to be India as well, working together. As you may or may not know, the current sort of up-and-coming players in the world economy are generally called the BRICs nation. BRICs meaning Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Now, other than Brazil, you might notice all these are in the eastern hemisphere of the world, and it's generally considered to be an eastern versus western divide, because the United States has an inordinate amount of influence in Europe, especially with the UK. The UK and the United States basically work together as the global hegemon right now. And hegemon's a fancy word for dictator, basically, but on an imperial global scale. Now, the reason I've decided to call this Brick Breaker is because, first of all, it's a clever play on words, because the United States and UK and Euro, up until very recently, have played the role of the BRICS breaker, the brick breaker, and the collapse of the petrodollar is the second half of the name, because the role of the BRICS nations, as they are the emergent economy of the world, is to at least gain as much power as the United States, if not overcome the power of the United States, and become the dominant economic and political and social force on the globe. So, Brick Breaker, the collapse of the petrodollar. Now, I don't know if I've talked about the petrodollar in a previous episode before, but if I haven't, allow me to give you a brief synopsis. Let's see. FDR comes to power. Well, got to go back further than that. The Federal Reserve, the Federal Bank of the United States of America, comes into power in early 1900s. That's part one of the emergence of the petrodollar. We'll get there. That's just the beginning of the history. The Fed emerges. Then whatever. The Roaring Twenties happened. Then the market crashes, and the Great Depression happens. FDR is elected president, and FDR seizes most of the private gold in the United States, and then puts us on the, well, we were already on the gold standard, but we begin printing Federal Reserve notes attached to the gold standard. The United States fights World War II, rescues the world against Nazism. The world divides into East and West at that point, between the communist East and the capitalist, ostensibly democratic West. Chinese Mao takes power in China, and at first it appears like China and Russia will be great allies in the war against the United States imperialism. The United States, in an effort to bolster capitalism and really its own economic base, loans lots and lots and lots of money to Western Europe, especially France and West Germany, Italy in particular, and England. And it's called the Marshall Plan. While this is happening, Europe is becoming seriously in debt to the United States, and this is after Bretton Woods Conference, where they basically started everyone's debt over at zero after World War II, so that they wouldn't have a repeat and have World War III, because people were trying to pay off war debt. So Bretton Woods happens after World War II. The Marshall Plan happens after Bretton Woods. Europe is racking up debt to the United States. We still have the gold standard, which means, in theory, anyone can trade their dollar for a piece of gold. In the 1950s America, if you were making 50 cents an hour, and you work 2 hours and got $1, you could go to Fort Knox or wherever the gold was being stored, trade in your dollar for $1 worth of gold, and that was the way that it worked. But then in the 60s, two significant things happened that started to drain the United States economy. One is the war in Vietnam, where we fought this useless, stupid fucking war that everyone knows about, and just the coffers of the government started to shrink. And then Europe's economy had grown to such a point that they were actually able to pay off their debt from the Marshall Plan after 15, 20 years. At that point, many nations, but especially France, who wanted to play the part of a third-party intermediary between the USSR and the United States, said, okay, we want our gold back. You say you could trade dollars for gold. We've now got dollars because we finally have paid you back. So now we want our gold. Here's some dollars, give us gold. And that happened more and more frequently throughout the 60s. And what basically the long and short of it is the Federal Reserve lied. They'd already gotten rid of the gold that was being stored in, like the French gold and the German gold that was being stored in America had already been gotten rid of, and it would have been a big catastrophe. So Richard Nixon, a little pissant in the middle of the night, got himself the gold standard at like midnight. He signed this executive order, basically saying we're not going to trade dollars for gold. The dollar inflated like crazy, and one big problem in the 70s was inflation. And he and his economic staff recognized that the United States was going to have to replace gold with something to stop paper assets from inflating into the atmosphere, basically. So, Richard Nixon's government, in cooperation with the Saudis. Now, I did talk about this on the Unholy Triumvirate video, where I explained why we're in the position that we're in now. The Saudis agreed to only accept dollars for oil in exchange for the United States giving military aid to Saudi Arabia to defend their illegal autocratic regime against their own people. So, fast forward decades and a few wars that we fought to keep the petrodollar in place, and you've got us basically where we are today. Except now, China is a capitalist country, although still run by the communist dictatorship, and Russia is no longer communist in fact or in party, but is in fact very much a fascist nation, founded on a small oligarchy of bankers and businessmen and the military. And now their economies are growing, especially China's. This year is the smallest growth that China has faced in 30 years, and they're still growing 6%, which we're not even growing 2%. So that's, they're still catching up quickly. And it's there's some economists saying that China's GDP, their total gross domestic product, has actually surpassed the United States' in the last year, making them the richest nation on earth. Now, Russia and China are doing all kinds of trade deals, and Chinese government is buying up gold like crazy, and there's lots of talk that the yuan is going to be a competing currency in the global market to the United States petrodollar. Now, what this means for the United States government is the money will start to inflate again, and especially if the yuan becomes the reserve currency of the world, or if there is this internationalized currency, which is what's being suggested as well as a possible solution to both problems, that of China's extreme economic growth in the United States is losing the petrodollar. Many are suggesting that, I believe it's called a CFR, which would be an international currency floating in all global markets as a sort of composite currency of the United States and the euro and the yuan in particular. And that's a lot of technical shit. But the point is this. All these things have led us to a global situation where there's two dominant competing markets right now. And they're dependent upon one another in many ways. And the two markets are the BRICs nations that I named and the West, which is the United States, the UK, and Europe, primarily. But the problem for the United States is, as I said, the petrodollar is dissolving because as soon as Russia and China can find a major oil trading partner that will trade for something other than dollars, either the yuan or the CFR or some kind of maybe direct gold or silver, the United States dollar will inflate. Especially since there's been so much quantitative easing the last few years, which is money printing. If the money is printed and printed and printed, while its hegemonic, monopolistic control of the oil markets is dissolved, then our currency in the United States will have basically zero basis outside of just violence and the violent control of our own people at that point, because that would lead to inflation or hyperinflation, which would lead, to an unsustainable, it would either lead to bread riots or it would lead to an unsustainable amount of government spending on social care and programs, which would, in some way or another, truly crack and change the new world order, as they call it, the world order, because the United States is broke, and we're broke on paper, we're broke in money, we're not broke in resources, we're still resource rich, labor rich, and we have so much power and prestige in the world, but in terms of paper, we are broke because of the end of the petrodollar, qualitative easing, because of the mortgage crisis created by Wall Street banks, because of the policies of the IMF and the World Bank, and because of the failures of the Eurozone. It does not look good for the economy of the United States in the next 5-10 years. It just doesn't. And it looks like it would be China and Russia who would have the most to gain. And as of late, the United States has actually, you might notice the gas prices have been going down significantly if you live here in the U.S. And it's not because of the shale oil boondoggle that certain idiots in this country are presenting as a solution to the problem of energy efficiency. No, it's not that, because that actually loses money. It doesn't gain money at all while destroying the environment. And in fact, on Wall Street, there's been speeches given on the Wall Street floor about how shale is not making money, period. Not even a little bit. They're never going to break even, let alone make a profit. So it's not because of the shale oil. It's because the United States is working in collusion and, in fact, in conspiracy with Saudi Arabia on the same deal we've always had, which is you scratch my back, I scratch yours. So Saudi Arabia is dumping. They're selling oil way too cheap, so cheap that they are going to destroy their own economy. But the way the Saudis see it, in my opinion, they know that they're going to be overthrown by their own people the minute they don't have an alliance with the United States anymore, because they are hated by the people of that country. And the way the United States sees it is, listen, you got to dump the oil, whatever you got to do, because Russia is an oil exporter. And because Russia is an oil exporter, and Russia and China lead the BRICs nations, we're crippling Russia on purpose economically to try to prevent them from hurting us in terms of the petrodollar. So because the United States and the West and the Sauds are dumping oil and vastly making it much cheaper than it really should be based on global demand, and because Russia and China are making these other trade deals, hoarding gold, trying to work towards floating the yuan, discussing direct sales with Iran. Both of these sides in this market are competing with each other to the bottom, and it's almost like a Cold War, except that it's not ideological. It's capitalist on both sides, but capitalism, when it runs out of ideological enemies, consumes other capitalist countries. That's what it does. Capitalist is a consumption, growth-based economy, and it must, like cancer, eat, 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 consume, 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 or it will die. Even if its cancer-like growth is killing everybody. In its own self-sustainment, this elite cadre of people running these different countries are willing to consume each other just to try to be on top. And that's what's happening in the brick breaker petrodollar crash situation. I'll make another video. I'll make Brick Breaker 2 soon. And it will be about how this relates to Syria and ISIS and the war in the Middle East. This has been Ryan O'Dowd of the Black Can Communique. The name of this episode was Brick Breaker, the petrodollar crash. I'm Ryan O'Dowd, and as always, fuck the banks.